This video is on Empire of Ash, the upcoming Doom of Valyria prequel TV series to Game of Thrones. In this one, I'm going to address a thematic topic on the overall setting in terms of world building. Low fantasy in a world of magic. Many other major prequel eras would have more magic in them than A Song of Ice and Fire, the War of the Five Kings era. Any era when the Targaryen dragons are still alive, because sometimes we don't think about it, but dragons are inherently fantastical magic creatures. So, Targaryen conquest through Dance of the Dragons, all the material covered in Fire and Blood Part 1. And even after that, there's still magic in the world. The Dunk and Egg series, for example, Bloodraven is secretly a sorcerer. But even that's in the abstract sense of if you do one of the later prequels. There are 4 prequels currently in contention at HBO. And they're the Long Night prequel, the Doom of Valyria prequel, and the other 2 are assuredly the Conquest and the Dance. Because Martin himself said Fire and Blood Part 1 has the basis for 2 of those prequel pitches in it. So while you could say, well, it can still be A Song of Ice and Fire if it's Dunk and Egg, they said they're not going to do that right now. Of the 4 they're currently considering, going by the major prequel novellas and prequel books that Martin has actually put out already, defined prequel narratives, all the ones they'd be considering have more magic in them. Dunk and Egg they're not going to do right now, they said that. So all they're considering face this issue. And pre-Doom Valyria has much more magic in it than the Conquest or the Dance. Though not so much as the Age of Heroes and the Long Night 8,000 years ago, which might as well be called the Age of Magic. So I've seen some people saying, oh, you just automatically dismissing Empire of Ash, that you can't do this, there's too much magic in it. That inherently needs to be mythical and backstory, that it would be wrong to show it, or maybe you couldn't because it breaks the realism. Well, if you were comparing Empire of Ash to a Dance of the Dragons TV show, there'd be some validity to that, but they said the 2 main frontrunners are Long Night and Doom of Valyria. So that argument doesn't really hold up, because you're comparing it to the most magical prequel possible. The Long Night, the Age of Heroes, and the Dawn Age, all these magical events. Still, even in isolation from other prequels, even if you were comparing this to a Dance of the Dragons or a Blackfire Rebellion's one they're not going to do right now, the writers themselves were worried about how will they handle magic compared to A Song of Ice and Fire? Because Empire of Ash was actually the first prequel that was pitched. Long Night was like one of the last ones, like the 4th one, I think. But officially they said we were the first one in 2016. When they were developing it, it wasn't in reaction to the other pitches. So fundamentally, how will it handle magic because it's set 400 years ago? Magic is much more prevalent in the world, and very specifically, it said that there was drastically more magic before the Doom of Valyria. It's not, if you look at it on a graph or something, it wouldn't be this gradual decline. There's this sharp drop-off after the Doom, because the Valyrians wielded so much magic. There's ties between magic and dragons. They said a lot of magic stopped working. Artifacts from Valyria that survived don't work anymore because they were like fueled by the power from their volcanoes or something, that there's officially a lot less magic after the Doom. But before the Doom, there's a lot more, and no one at this time denies that magic exists. Like how in Book 1, Season 1, Game of Thrones, there's some people who doubt magic ever existed, or they wonder if dragons were just some kind of animal and they weren't magic, or some people never seen one think they're just a fable. Dance of the Dragons would have a big difference at just living in King's Landing, you would see dragons flying around, compared to how awe-inspiring it is at the end of Game of Thrones, Season 1, Book 1, when, oh my god, there's dragons that have come alive again, these creatures out of myth. A Dance or Conquest series wouldn't have that. Well, yeah, we see them all the time. In Valyria, there's overtly spellcasters and all sorts of other things, dragons, artifacts. It's not just, oh, well, yeah, dragons exist, but maybe they're not magical. People know magic is a force in the world, even by the time of Valyria, long after the Age of Heroes ended. Now, as I said in other videos, I was shown in a big leak the series Bible to Empire of Ash, and my source was explaining things to me from it. And I said before that there's these series of mission statement essays in it that cover different topics. It's a guide for the writers of how are we going to address different issues like economics or diversity, racial diversity, or gender and world building and other various topics. And one of them, they were talking to me, they went, well, let me tell you about this section here. These aren't my words on this slide here. They told me this pretty much word for word, so I'm trying to quote what they said to me a couple of months ago, that it emphasizes in the series Bible, we're striving to match the low fantasy tone of A Song of Ice and Fire as much as possible, while struggling with the fact that magic is more prevalent. Dragons exist in large numbers. Valyrian steel weapons are in wide use. There's blood magic. They have glass candles. I'm going to talk about all that at the end of the video. A few specific examples. So this essay they were reading off me, the preamble says, our goal is the difficult task of depicting low fantasy in a world of magic. Now, thinking on it, I didn't see the page clearly, and they were reading it off to me verbally, so I'm not sure if the essay has a formal title, like the chapter on this has a title, or if that's just the turn of phrase they personally used, that it's like a sentence in there or something. But even if it doesn't have a title, that's a really good title and sums up the issue, so I'm functionally using it as the title, you understand it. Low fantasy in a world of magic, and the difficulty of depicting that, the challenge. I see it as a challenge to be met. So I'm going to be talking about that through the rest of this video. This is from Wikipedia. Low fantasy, if you haven't heard the term before, places relatively less emphasis on typical elements associated with fantasy, setting a narrative in realistic environments with elements of the fantastical. Sometimes there are just enough fantastical elements to make ambiguous the boundary between what is real and what is purely psychological or supernatural. The word low refers to the level of prominence of traditional fantasy elements within the work. Now, when I was looking this up, the definition I always used, and which I've seen people using to describe A Song of Ice and Fire as this big example of the low fantasy genre, is the definition used by tvtropes.com with really good examples and a list of definitions, characteristics. And if you look this up on Wikipedia, I'm saying the Wikipedia article on this is terrible, and it doesn't use the same definition. So I'll rattle it off and explain what's wrong with it very quickly. Let's just move through this. Wikipedia lists how authors in past decades gave a very limited and problematic definition of low fantasy as intrusion of magic into our otherwise non-magic world. Now, Martin's Song of Ice and Fire has usually been described as low fantasy in what TV Tropes uses, which is frankly what I always thought low fantasy was. I had never even heard the Wikipedia one. And there's various problems in the Wikipedia article. For example, it lists off that author Nikki Gamble in 2008 made a list of 3 characteristics high fantasy has that low does not. And it wouldn't have all 3, but it could be one of these 3 things. 1, our primary world does not exist, like Dungeons and Dragons. Earth doesn't exist. 2, entered through a portal, like Alice in Wonderland or Narnia. It's a portal to this other world. Or 3, a world within a world, like Harry Potter. That could plausibly cover any entry in science fiction and fantasy. Well, it could be our world, or it could be a portal to another world, or it could be a world layered on ours. This could describe anything. This is broad and contradictory. And even the Wikipedia page has a subsection pointing out major criticisms of this, that many works don't neatly fit that categorization, one or the other, that people usually hold up Tolkien's Middle-earth as a big example of high fantasy, and in terms of its tone it is, but in terms of its morals, the fate of the world is at stake, but Tolkien himself, till the day he died, for decades, vocally insisted Middle-earth is supposed to be our, what he called the primary world, but in the distant mythological past. He said it's like 6,000 years ago, before modern history, and you get that sense that this is pre-modern Europe, eons ago. And there is magic, but it's fairly realistic. I mean, there's no complex spellcasting system with rules like Dungeons & Dragons. Most of the combat is done with swords. And there are monsters and stuff, but on top of that, the article starts by listing Harry Potter as high fantasy, and then includes that there are critics going, well, no, it's low fantasy, in that Harry himself doesn't know magic at the beginning, and if you're going that it intrudes on his non-magical life. But tonally, on the other hand, it's, when you get down to it, actually much more focused on the fate of individual characters. That it starts off with that Voldemort is this generic Dark Lord, and then you really get a sense of him as he's really Tom Riddle, this bigoted hate-monger character, and how even Harry can pity him for how low he's fallen and how bitter he is at the world. That it's really this personal confrontation between these two people, that Voldemort isn't the living embodiment of evil the way Sauron is, that, well, he is an embodiment of what we would consider an evil person, but it's characters, and it's intruding in his life, so really it doesn't match that high versus low dichotomy. It's a separate subgenre entirely. Urban fantasy. I mean, I hold up Harry Potter as one of the great examples of urban fantasy, the world within the world hiding underneath the main one. And that's fine. They don't need to fit into these two categories. I never associated the term low fantasy, for that matter, with magic intruding into an otherwise magical world. I've always seen it used purely in the sense of TV tropes, which focuses on how the amount of fantastical elements is low, and tonally the focus is on realistic issues. And magic might not need to suddenly intrude at all, though if it does, it would be out of place and amazing in universe. Most people in A Song of Ice and Fire are surprised by Melisandre's magical powers, but it would still be Westeros without her. Like, the Dunk and Egg series has a little magic implied in the background, with Bloodraven increasingly, but like the first one, the Hedge Knight, there isn't really magic in it. So, the point of all this is just, if you Google this, do not trust the Wikipedia page. It's a mess. It even has a subsection pointing out we aren't giving a clear definition of this, whereas TV tropes gave a very clear definition of what low fantasy versus high fantasy is, with a clearly defined checklist. So if you go in the info box below, I link only to the TV tropes page on low fantasy. Which, again, in interviews with Martin talking about this is low fantasy, this is always the sense he talks about it with. So I'm just warning you off the Wikipedia one. So what are the criteria that TV tropes list for what distinguishes low fantasy from high fantasy? Moving on here. Setting, scope, morality, methods, and heroes. The setting of low fantasy doesn't have much magic in it. It's pseudo-historical, human-dominant. Magical creatures and non-human races are either non-existent or, in the case of magical creatures and animals like dragons, treated as animals regularly encountered in that world. The world strictly follows certain rules. Next, the scope is more down-to-earth, focused on survival or petty politics, not literally the fate of the world, in the sense of the dimension will collapse or evil will cover all the land. At most, it's fighting over the throne to a vast kingdom, but that's still, in the grand scheme of things, petty politics. Then, morality has shades of gray, not the ultimate battle of good versus evil. Similar to scope, but also, it can be Dunk running out of money in the Dunk and Egg, is low fantasy. And A Song of Ice and Fire can still run into that with the Iron Throne running into a debt crisis. That this is not literally fighting demons and angels. Methods in low fantasy, victory is usually achieved through political means, not magic battles or moral superiority. There isn't going to be what Tolkien called the eucatastrophe moment when Frodo destroys the ring, which he had set up for 3 books as destroy the ring, Sauron will instantly die. So that wasn't a cheat. We knew that would happen, that it was this inherent flaw in Sauron putting all of his power into that one thing. But there is no Deus Ex Machina. And again, Tolkien argued, well, it's a eucatastrophe and I set it up well enough in advance. There's arguments about that, but that it is purely through political maneuvering, not some instant magic ray gun superweapon is going to destroy all the orcs or something that we didn't know about already. And lastly, prophecies and chosen ones are usually avoided when it comes to the heroes. There's a lot of heroes. Yes, A Song of Ice and Fire has prophecies in it and a chosen one prophecy about the prince who was promised, but it was relatively toned down at first. This is a low fantasy world that suddenly starts turning into having high fantasy elements in it, but people react to it in terms of low. That isn't to the level of Wheel of Time or something with the Dragon Reborn and all these major prophecies. Most people in A Song of Ice and Fire haven't even heard the Prince That Was Promised prophecy. So, in the tvtropes.com article on low fantasy, their entry for A Song of Ice and Fire sums this up as that it's a generally low magic setting with a cynically pragmatic worldview and a focus on political maneuvering between rival factions who are all at least morally gray. That there's no designated hero, there's certainly no designated villains, except in the most extreme cases. However, the politics span 2 continents and reach epic levels on its own, even without the more traditional, stirring high-adventure elements. And because the magic comes back slowly over the course of the story, that when the dragons come back, magic starts turning on again in the world, spells work a lot better, the fantasy does get progressively higher as the series goes on, even though the general tone remains low in nature. The magic and other mysteries are treated as ambiguous yet highly dangerous, potentially world-changing and complicating factors in an already combustible political and social situation. And Martin himself has repeatedly emphasized this isn't some externalized battle of good versus evil when he loves Tolkien, and that was how Tolkien was verbalizing and externalizing the conflict in humans, but he said, he always quotes off this big thing Faulkner said. As William Faulkner said, the only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. Some really cool action scene where Jon Snow fights off 20 men is entertaining, but what's provocative is Jon torn between his duties to the Night's Watch, House Stark, and his growing alignment with the Wildlings. Jaime Lannister is a huge one, just his conflicting loyalties. This is amazing. I always love series that do this. How it's fascinating in real life as well, in real history. How good people sometimes do bad things, and how bad people sometimes do good things. Not the battle of good and evil against a dark lord, or the battle between the living and the dead. That's actually relatively boring. We're fighting off an army of mindless zombies, compared to these moral conflicts. And the puzzle that is the human heart and mind. So, faced with all of that backdrop of this is how A Song of Ice and Fire handled low fantasy, and is seen as a major example of the move towards this low fantasy genre, how will Empire of Ash try to be like A Song of Ice and Fire, that tonally similar enough to that? Well, as I said in the original leak post on Game of Thrones Wiki, which this is a direct quote from the series Bible, my source was quoting it off to me, told me write this down specifically because it's one of the chapter introductions. This story centers on the decline and fall of Valyria, a colonial empire which ruled half of the known world at its height. It reveals the social, economic, and political crises which tore apart the empire from within. A major focus of this prequel is on diversity and immigration, naturalization, and just the issue of cultural identity and what it means to be Valyrian. Who gets that power and prestige? What you don't see mentioned here is the eternal battle of good versus evil, but stressing social issues and economic issues, not good versus evil. And there was a lot of this in the series Bible. A major focus of Empire of Ash will be on practical politics and intrigue, much of it rooted in realistic economics, just like A Song of Ice and Fire. How economic issues determine which political factions are powerful, ultimately fueling wars. You think it's just boring and dry, this is their tax policy. That's why the Lannisters are rich. That's why Littlefinger has enough money to bribe people through manipulating economics. And this is how most real-life wars were fought over money and who was able to generate more to get more power. So they're going to do things that are similar to tonally. It's not like, oh no, this is going to be this big shift. They're trying to self-consciously match things like the Crown debt crisis plotline, first with Tywin, and then the Iron Bank of Bravos. All this bickering over money in small council scenes, which really the TV show stopped focusing on after season 5, when it's actually becoming a lot more prominent in the books. When the 4th book, the economic crisis cripples Westeros, and the banks start siding with Stannis and saying, we will give you loans for 30,000 more men to hire mercenaries. That is a major factor which will have huge impact in upcoming books, and the TV show is ignoring it now, but this was a drastic change, and it just sort of faded away. So how is it going to be realistic? Well, there's going to be economic emphasis. I talked about in, say, the Freeholders video, how these are powerful money barons, and the various industries they control, they'll explain this is why they're powerful. Meanwhile, the political storylines and family individual level drama will match the tone of the War of the Five Kings storyline in A Song of Ice and Fire. That the immediate storyline when it begins is the civil wars break out that tear the Valyrian freehold apart. And the way they phrase this to me, and I did say this in the leak report, is that the story functions on 3 levels. The political factions, the family and individual level, like Tywin versus Tyrion stuff, and then the mythical level stuff, epoch-changing storyline things like the Return of the White Walkers or the coming doom of Valyria, which are looming in the background for later seasons. And even then, as with the White Walker storyline in the books, the focus is on how humans respond to it. And they didn't tell me that much about the family individual stuff, because that's a little too spoilery, and the mythical stuff is in the background, we'll get to that, but most of what I was told was about the political stuff, which is what will be prominent in Season 1, so that's most relevant. I will say that at this point, potentially, I think any of the factions could have intentionally or accidentally caused the doom, and for selfish reasons like revenge or trying to harness more power. There are various theories. We might not really know. For example, the Sphinxes, the old guard conservative faction of the Dragon Lords, maybe they were losing, so they blew up Valyria on purpose rather than let anyone else have it. Or, just as probable, maybe they were losing, so they tried to harness too much power, and accidentally this caused them to blow themselves up. That, no, we can't handle that much power, and they used too much and volcanoes blew. I think any of the factions I've described, the Sphinxes, the Young Dragons, the Freeholders, anyone could have intentionally or accidentally caused the doom. We don't know. So it's going to be fun to speculate. That's going to be the major plot mystery that they're moving towards. But even then, it's going to be tied to human responses and human reactions. So, Empire of Ash and how it will be low fantasy, or trying to be. Morally, there are shades of gray. There's no designated heroes. I mean, there are protagonists, but, sometimes your protagonist can practically be an antagonist. Like Jaime Lannister. I don't like using the labels protagonist or antagonist. He's a POV character who is morally mixed and conflicted. So some people, when they heard the basic description of this, said, oh, the Sphinxes are the old conservative faction. They must be the bad guys, and the Freeholders are good. No, the Sphinxes aren't bad. The Freeholders aren't good. The Freeholders practice slavery just as much as the Sphinxes do. The Sphinxes they still have a sense of nobility about them. The young dragons are really these, at the worst, they're almost like, just reading into this, like Mark Antony or, House Frey types, who they really are just greedy usurpers, that they're not fighting for freedom. They want to be the Sphinxes. They want to be the guys in charge. That's the only thing separating them, that they want power. So these are three morally gray factions, neither one of which is objectively totally good or totally evil. Then their methods. There's a focus on pragmatic politics between the factions. And yes, they have magical items, they have dragons, but they obey certain rules. That it's stressed this in the series Bible, that you have to follow rules we established realistically. Then the scope. Who gets political power in the Valyrian Empire is what they're focused on, not fate of the world, fight the Dark Lord stuff. And Valyria does blow up in the end, but that's not evil permeating all existence. It's like a big nuke going off, but it's not evil permeating our dimension. And the setting is pseudo-historical. It's, unlike the Long Night, it's human-dominant. There aren't any non-human races. Magic is treated as a reliable part of its world. They can't just make up new abilities or ignore established limits. A big principle that TV Tropes, again, I keep turning to this, defines as the principle of Magic A is Magic A. That once you establish a magical rule, even though it's fictional, you have to obey it. Magic A's Magic A is basically about internal consistency. That, like, in Star Wars, if they establish that X-Wing's hyperdrive cannot instantaneously teleport from Tatooine to Coruscant, you have to follow that rule, even though hyperdrive is fictional and basically magic. And there are other sci-fi universes that allow for fold space technology where, you instantly teleport places, or a Stargate or something, but once you've established a hyperdrive isn't the thing that does that, you have to follow that. So, dragons are magical creatures, that is true, they are fictional, and magic might not be 100% definable, but after you consistently establish their maximum flight speed and range over a long period of time, you can't break your own rules. If dragons don't talk, after 5 TV seasons or books, and in 300 years of the Targaryens having them, they've said, this isn't the kind of fictional world where dragons can talk, they're not sapient, they're not intelligent like that. They won't suddenly start talking. This isn't like Pern dragons can talk telepathically. And if they don't literally teleport like Pern dragons in all that time or throughout recorded history, like in Season 8 or Book 6, we shouldn't suddenly be learning, oh yeah, dragons can teleport, when it was never even hinted at. If you hint at it, that's different, but no, you can't break your own rules. I mean, literally popping out of existence, then popping into existence somewhere else, literally like Nightcrawler from X-Men teleporting. You can't break your own rules like that. You never establish they can do that. And it might surprise you, I consider myself a loose constructionist, like Theodore Roosevelt. For those of you not in the United States, he said the president can do anything except what the Constitution specifically says he can't do. Versus other people saying you can only do what it specifically says you can do. But no, I can do anything so long as it doesn't specifically say I can't do it. And that's my approach to fantasy, really, that Star Wars, again, intentionally avoided making a definitive list of Force powers to be free to introduce new ones, such as Force lightning in Return of the Jedi. I mean, I wasn't alive at the time, I didn't see this in theaters, but how did people react to suddenly, wait, you can shoot lightning from your hands with the Force when they saw the third movie? But there are rational limits. Well, we never said you can't shoot lightning from your hands using the Force. That after this much time, with this much established canon, they wouldn't introduce that a Jedi can literally teleport if even Yoda never did, when there are points where he would have if he could. And that's not even to say they couldn't, I don't know, introduce some type of alien race or star dragon force monster that they go, it can literally teleport because we've never seen it before. That you can't retcon things, that you've established that the Emperor never literally teleported, Yoda never literally teleported. It would be silly to introduce that at this point because there are other times where it would have been important. Breaking established rules is worse than inventing new abilities that you never said they can't do. Magic A is Magic A. And I actually think Martin hit a good balance with this, with his depictions of Melisandre and magic in A Song of Ice and Fire. If you actually pay attention to it in the books, even characters who use some magic don't actually understand it as well as they think they do. This is a major point in the books. They're meddling with powers beyond human comprehension. And they can utilize some of the relatively basic abilities, relatively compared to these awe-inspiring things of the past, but even Melisandre is only tapping the shallow end of things. Compared to what magic can do, like reshaping entire continents or something on the level of gods, that she is at the Tinker Toy level of what magic can do. This basic level, the shallow end. And even she admits in her POV chapters that she doesn't have full mastery of magic. That she doesn't understand the prophetic visions she sees. She sees them, but she doesn't have full comprehension of them. That a lot of what she does is sleight of hand, and a lot of it is real magic, but she emphasizes it. The way that Martin has handled magic in his works, particularly with characters like Melisandre, and which Empire Vash is trying to follow, really reminds me of the classic 1956 sci-fi film Forbidden Planet, which should come as no surprise because Martin has openly said this is one of his favorite movies and a major influence on his writings. That in the movie, this survey ship goes to the planet Altair 4, where they find the one survivor from the previous survey team, Dr. Morbius, and his daughter. And while stranded on this dead alien planet, he found the ruins of this lost civilization known as the Krell. And as Morbius explains, the Krell were incomprehensibly more advanced than humanity, that we really couldn't even understand their technology, much less use it. And they even have this artificial education machine that it zaps your brain and it makes you more intelligent. And he used their education machine to boost his IQ to twice a normal human's. Enough that he can understand some of the lower levels of their technology, the basic intro stuff, and do things like build the functioning artificial intelligence robot, Robbie the Robot. This is beyond what humanity is currently capable of doing. This is fantastical to the survey ship that finds them, the C-57D. And he's basically a wizard to them, sci-fi as fantasy. He's this wizard they found who can do these amazing things. The story is loosely based on Shakespeare's The Tempest, so he's Prospero. But he stresses this. Even he admits that despite saying my IQ is twice the normal humans now, he'd be severely mentally retarded compared to the Krell themselves. And he has only scratched the surface of their full powers. That they have these vast machines that can create anything at mere thought. He doesn't know how to use them. He doesn't fully understand all of their technology. He can access some of the basic stuff. which is still fantastical to regular humans, but, he goes, I don't understand everything they could do. And you should really watch this film, apart from the fact that it's pretty good and influenced a lot of later stuff. It influenced Star Trek for its relative realism. It also probably influenced how the White Walkers are handled. The revelation from the show that they were weapons built by the children of the forest that turned on their creators. That comes up in a lot of sci-fi, like The Terminator or something, but that was also a major theme in Forbidden Planet, that they built the pinnacle of their civilization, their greatest achievement, was they built a machine that could will anything into being at mere thought. And they didn't realize that it didn't just copy your conscious thoughts, it could copy your subconscious thoughts and feelings like jealousy or hate, even ones you would never act on. So it instantly created an army of nightmare creatures, monsters of the id, like the living embodiment of hate or jealousy, these monsters, and they tore apart their entire civilization in a single day. So that whole theme of turning on their creators inadvertently, that's also with the White Walkers, and you can see that influence from Forbidden Planet in it. I mean, I'm not the first one to point out that connection. Westeros.org pointed out, this kind of seems like Forbidden Planet. He loves that movie. So just another aspect of that is that Dr. Morbius stresses to them, what I can do seems fantastical to you, and I'm twice as smart as a regular human, but the Krell and everything they could do is beyond even me. I'm scratching the surface of this. Even you built a self-aware robot that their technology level has nothing approaching that. And he went, well, yeah, but the Krell they could make things at mere thought. I don't know how to do that. And you see the parallels between that and how in A Song of Ice and Fire, Melisandre can use some of the basic levels, but even she doesn't really know what the gods are. Like Dungeons and Dragons or Warcraft, there's characters who literally interact with gods. There are gods in A Song of Ice and Fire, but Martin has said they're indefinable. No one religion got it right. It's tied to magic. I myself don't know what it is. That it's forces that it's not just that I'm not revealing them. They're incomprehensible to us. They're so far beyond. And at times we can kind of get them to do what we want to do, but it's messing with powers beyond human comprehension. And you can do some of the low-level stuff. Now, just to go over some slides quickly from one of my earlier videos, I stressed in the Sphinx's video that the Valyrian Dragon Lords in the years leading up to the Doom of Valyria are not the same as the ancient Valyrians. The ancient Valyrians, or I've been calling them Proto-Valyrians like Proto-Indo-European, they are the ones that used magic to tame dragons and harness the power of the 14 flames and the volcano chain and build a vast empire. And they did it 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years before the Doom. That is a long time. Even the older faction of Dragon Lords, the Sphinxes, they descend from the original Valyrian aristocracy. They are their direct descendants, blue blood nobility. They're their heirs, but they're separated by 5,000 years. And they're the most magical faction. After that, you have the young dragons who are soldiers who got promoted up. They're the younger aristocracy. And the freeholders are just the local bankers and merchants. Because they're the heirs of the original Valyrian aristocracy, the Sphinxes are closer to what the ancient Valyrians, the Proto-Valyrians, were like. So they're half what we're familiar with as Targaryen or Valyrian, and half something else. We haven't really seen this even in the books yet. They're Targaryens to the Targaryens, this ancient mysterious culture relative to them. But even then, the Sphinxes are the closest surviving thing to the Proto-Valyrians, and really the only clues anyone has about what they were like. But they're clues, not certain facts, just bits and pieces to go on. And at least some of it is actually true. There's more magic, but don't dismiss them. A lot of it got distorted just from time. So I said in the other video, how much are the Starks like their ancestors, the First Men? Saying, oh, we can't have a TV series that shows all the magic. That would take the mystery out of it. Well, showing the early Starks in pre-conquest Westeros 400 years ago is not the same thing as showing us the First Men, even during the Andal invasions. that thousands of years separate them. And they're similar, and you can see that they evolved out of each other, but there's archaic differences. So I made this chart that just as the wildlings are a bit closer to first men, but not exactly like them, we don't know that all these magical powers they had that we don't. Like, the wildlings are more aware of that, like, skin-changing, warging, and green sight are real, that the Starks forgot that. But even the wildlings, they don't know as much magic as the first men did, like, not enough to wield it in large numbers. That they're this hybrid state, this transitional state from first men to Starks. Similarly, the Sphinxes, while closer to magic than the Targaryens, they are not the Proto-Valyrians. And what really sums it up is this quote from A Clash of Kings, the second novel, where Luwin says, "Perhaps magic was once a mighty force in the world, but no longer. What little remains is no more than the wisp of smoke that lingers in the air after a great fire is burned out, and even that is fading. Valyria was the last ember, and Valyria is gone." When you look at this shining city, Valyria, the pinnacle of human civilization built by magic, this city of wonders, compared to the vast sweep of history, like how much magic was going on in the Dawn Age, where people were shaping continents and wizards were spellcasting and wielding all sorts of powers, everything that Valyria was, this stunning city of magic, was considered the last ember, relative to what was going on in the Age of Heroes. So they can play around with that, oh, they're not going to show you all the magic. The mystery, just as the mystery of the Wall and the White Walkers, and we're not going to see all of it, happened in The Song of Ice and Fire. In Empire of Ash, the mystery is, what were the ancient Valyrians like? Because it's not like, oh, we're going back to the time of magic. There were intervening time periods where, by gradation, there was slightly more magic, but the age of magic has passed by this point in time. And there's more magic, but it's not nearly as much as there was during these ages of myth and wonders. It was an ember. The second point is that Martin has repeatedly said on the other end of the spectrum that magic which characters fully understand is just technology by another name. For a lot of things, Dungeons and Dragons, Warcraft, if you fully understand how it works, it's just your version of technology. It's called magic, as he said, because it's not fully understood. Because it's messing with powers we don't fully understand. If you know how to make magic like people know how to make nuclear weapons or lasers or jet engines, it's not really magic, it's technology. Your analog of that technology. Now, some people from around book fandom, who I explained this to, were worried from the way I phrased it that, oh, this is going to be a prequel trying to show the age of magic. And when I said, well, it's going to treat it in detail, that, oh, you're saying that they're going to try to explain magic like a technology? No, don't take that meaning. They're not going to try to go, oh, no, this is like how Pern starts out as fantasy and then gradually it's revealed it's the far future and the dragons are genetically engineered and stuff. No. When I say it's going to treat with magic realistically, I don't mean it's going to come up with real-world physics explanations for it. Just that it will deal with the logical ripple effects of a world with magic in it. That is what I mean. That dragons are magical creatures, and magic might not be fully understandable, but it has measurable aspects or effects that need to be consistent. Magic A is magic A. Taking as a given, okay, there's these magic giant creatures, but there's certain things you can measure. That it's established that a dragon needs to eat a measurable number of sheep, or it'll starve to death. Okay, what happens if you can't afford enough sheep to feed it? Or stuff with that whole Season 7 TV show White Hunt storyline of, no, the books are pretty consistent about how far and how fast dragons can fly. So even though it might defy our understanding of physics, once you establish they can't instantly fly from King's Landing to Marine in a single hour, you can't keep doing that. But once you do, okay, how does that affect a society that where you're capable of flying that fast? Or how does your economy work if you need a certain number of 1,000, a million, X number of sheep to feed these dragons. That there's ripple effects that would have an impact, and what impact would it have on the world if you had dragons? So, in summary, how will they be trying to address low fantasy in a world of magic, that there's more magic in Empire of Ash than there was in A Song of Ice and Fire? 2 points. First, magic will still be mysterious because even the Sphinxes don't fully understand it. Not as well as the ancient Valyrians, who are their distant ancestors, and even the ancient Valyrians never fully understood it. Like how in A Song of Ice and Fire, Melisandre uses magic, but even she doesn't fully understand it. She's not the same as the people who created the ancient prophecies thousands of years ago. And I talk about this more in the Sphinxes video, that we're going to have a lot of fun picking apart and theorizing, just looking at the Sphinxes. What the heck did the ancient Valyrians they descend from do 5,000 years ago that resulted in this? Like how we pick apart stuff from the wildlings to try to guess what the first men were like. So that mystery element of that magic is still unknowable, and we get a few more hints, basically. We're going to get some juicy hints in this, but they're never going to fully reveal, or at least not initially, what did the ancient Valyrians do. I mean, we're not going to see them on screen, but characters are going to talk about it, the way Melisandre talks about magic. Second, and there's a lot more material on this, magic can be treated realistically by taking the magic part as a given, but following the logical ripple effects that would have in the world. How it affects economics. Dragons are magic, but you need to be able to afford enough sheep to feed them. Valyrian steel is magically sharper than any real material, but okay, you have these things that can cut like that. What is the effect of that? You need to strictly follow set rules of magic in ways that, well, Season 7 of Game of Thrones didn't. Magic A is Magic A. So, I don't know if the balance between low fantasy realism and magic is something anyone can get right. Even A Song of Ice and Fire itself, there's people pointing out, as more magic comes in by the later books, this is inherently not as realistic as when it started. That is an issue, but the people making Empire of Ash at least want to approach it how A Song of Ice and Fire did. I'm still deeply impressed at the effort they put into it, that there's this whole mission statement essay among several in the series Bible explaining and hammering home, we need to keep our magic consistent, we can't just make up stuff as we go along, we can't break our own rules, this has to be grounded, and really urging that from the beginning, that this is a principle we will follow. And this might be something no one can get 100% right. I mean, dragons exist in a show trying to be realistic. They're trying. That they're trying really impressed me, whereas other people like, how dare you judge us or even ask that question, kid? It's a TV show. This is an ideal they're striving for. Now, wrapping up here, I want to stress there was only one point in an hours-long video chat in which my source got slightly annoyed or defensive. I was asking a fanboyish question that at one point I was getting really excited, and I asked, what kind of creatures will we see in this besides dragons? New creatures and stuff like giants and direwolves we had in the original. I asked, it's Valyria. We know there are fireworms in Valyria. Will there be fireworms in this? Or thylacines? That's only the hyper-obsessive wiki fans would know that there's this one point, and I've talked about this in the earlier videos in this playlist, where Sirio in the first book explains that there are animals which are basically thylacines, the Tasmanian tiger, and that thylacines aren't extinct in their worlds, and they're called pouch tigers in their world. That's the term we came up for it, and they've been mentioned exactly once. But I've always been going, wow, what if a prequel could show some thylacines? Because thylacines are cool. But apart from that, they wouldn't go out of their way to show that, but that's just the way I said it at the time. I asked, what kind of creatures will there be? We know of fireworms in Valyria. I think that's a question a lot of people would instantly ask. If they mention fireworms killing slaves in the mines, will there be fireworms in a Valyria prequel? And they shot me a look defensively, and they said, I quote, "This isn't a creature feature. It's a serious political drama that happens to have dragons in it." Which was not only a great response, it really warmed my heart to that this is the approach they are taking. Not, wow, I want to see a zombie bear because it's cool. No. The CGI, the creatures serve drama, which is political. Serious drama. And that these people actively have this mentality. As I said at the beginning of the video, there's 3 points I want to quickly cover on, okay, what are magic things that exist which would have ripple effects? First is, they just said, yeah, that's in it. That they've repeatedly described in the books that Valyria has towers in it that can only be accessed from the air. They're landing pads for dragons. Think of it like Coruscant from Star Wars, that you can fly from one tower to another without touching the ground. They just went, oh, yeah, you'll see that. But that's obvious, that you'll have, like, if they're meeting in the Senate or something, they will land at the top of the tower on a dragon rather than coming up from the bottom. But that's just logical world building. We already knew that. Yeah, you'll see that. The other thing we discussed was, and they cited this as an example, that there's more Valyrian steel in the world. More characters have it. It's not everyone has it, just as not everyone in Westeros has good quality castle-forged steel, regular steel, like the feudal levies, who are basically just peasants, have sharpened sticks and hoes, farming implements, versus Jaime can have a good quality steel weapon. Similarly, there's a spectrum, but there's a lot more Valyrian characters who are lords who have dragon steel, who have Valyrian steel. And just, that is an issue, and they thought of it, that, well, yeah, but people also have dragon steel armor. They didn't tell me anything we didn't already know. Just, that is one of the things the series Bible addresses, is they have things like Valyrian steel more. That you will see them making Valyrian steel and utilizing it. That in A Song of Ice and Fire, there's only 200 of those in all of Westeros, and when Jon Snow gets Longclaw, it's like getting Excalibur. That Valyrian steel is more common in this world, and we'll see that, but that's inherent to it. The third point is really the reason I made this entire video. It started as a 5-minute thing, and I wanted to explain more of why this is so interesting to me. This is really the focus of this video. Is in Westeros, they have the Messenger Raven network, that every major castle has a rookery where they have ravens, and they send messages with them using the maesters. And you saw that in the TV show, too, that messages travel relatively quickly on the scale of a continent. A couple of weeks or days, but you see people in, like, Season 1 reacting to something that happened a week ago in King's Landing, which might take 2 months to travel up the King's Road to get to Winterfell. And it's not instantaneous, and it only works between places that have castles. Valyria doesn't have the Messenger Raven network, because they have something better, the glass candles. In the books, it explains that the Valyrians have glass candles, as they call them. A glass candle is made of obsidian, dragon glass. It's a dragon glass candle. That's the full name. And it's made out of that, but different from how it's used in swords. And the Valyrians infused spells into them, so that when sorcerers made them burn, they could basically use them like a Palantir in Lord of the Rings. Crystal balls, see across vast distances, and most often use them to communicate with each other even half a world apart. That this isn't back and forth messenger ravens, This is an instantaneous communication device, or artifact. And they could hold real-time conversations between all parts of the Valyrian Empire. And what this reminds me of is something Arthur C. Clarke said, actually, the famous sci-fi author. Arthur C. Clarke asked what he thought the invention in coming decades would be that had the most impact on our everyday lives, basically predicted the smartphone. Like, in literal terms, he's describing what a smartphone will be in 1976. We're going to have these handheld devices, we can send information to our friends, it'll be pictorial video information, it can be messages, books, text messages and writing, and you wait and they pick it up. Sometimes it can be instantaneous. You can get all sorts of information from it, like airplane flights. You can buy things with it, and it will selectively hunt and bring things. He's describing Google before it existed, that many of you are probably watching this on a smartphone now, that he predicted that, and more so than any other thing like jet flight or other forms of nuclear power or space satellites. Well, those use cell phones. He just went, what he's describing is, think about just how much your everyday routine is changed by having a smartphone. That you can instantly check on information, that if you're going to a party, you can instantly update with people who aren't there. You don't even have to wait for a telephone in your house. You can do it on the move. And just the ripple effects of how that has changed our society. And I think it's wonderful. I remember the early 90s still, when we didn't have smartphones, and just how much the daily course of our lives is affected, that people can update you wherever you are on what is going on. And think about just how much that slowed down things in A Song of Ice and Fire. You see Robb reading messages from King's Landing that took weeks to get there, and he has to react to them. Or, biggest example would be Robb's failed strategic campaign in southern Westeros, where they phrase it like it's Edmure's fault, even in the books, when it's Robb told him, hold the line of the river of the Red Fork of the Trident, and didn't specify, I want you to make a feigned retreat so we can lure Tywin away from King's Landing. So then when he was told, hold the line of the river, and he did, Robb was furious with him. He said, you were supposed to lose. And Edmure's like, how could I have known that? Or that then Tywin pulled all of his army back east to King's Landing. Well, then Robb could have at least made a rush for Casterly Rock, that they could not physically communicate that fast. Even if they wanted to, which he didn't. Just how hard it was for Robb to coordinate the movements of two separate armies at the same time in different parts of a continent. That the Valyrians can use glass candles to coordinate army movements in real time. Think about the impact that would have on a story. Or like when you're writing generalized TV, that sometimes you have like a police drama that's set in the past. The simple impact of, is this a time period where the police have cell phones or they don't, affects story mechanics through a ripple effect in so many ways. They can't instantly react to new information. And of course, we wouldn't get something like the White Hunt. I mean, how many people are upset about that? That, okay, on 3 separate levels, Gendry can't run that fast, dragons can't fly that fast, and more importantly, more than the dragons, you've had 7 years clearly establishing that they go, oh, you're trying to get out a protractor, see how fast a raven flies. The number of the distance is meaningless. It's time. That you have spent 7 years showing that it takes more than a day for a raven to get from the wall to Dragonstone and King's Landing. And this is casual viewers everywhere. It can't be shut down of how many people are reacting to this who put up with stuff in seasons 5 and 6 going, this is breaking the physical reality of the world. You've shown the Raven Network is not remotely that fast. Is nowhere near that fast. And now, by comparison, in Empire of Ash, you could have someone send a message from as far north as the Wall to King's Landing in real time. And how much that would affect dragon movements. Dragons are said to be faster than any ship. So I'm leaving that with you as an open question of looking at the map here of the Valyrian Freehold, that just how much is this going to affect basic story mechanics? That they told me, well, yeah, they have the glass candles and their instantaneous communication, so that affects the story. How, they didn't specify. We moved on to talking about something else. But just how big of a change it is. Subtle but realistic. Realistic ripple effects, that they don't have messenger ravens, they have instantaneous communication using the glass candles, which we assumed would be in this. They're a big part of Valyria. So I am looking forward to that, of just seeing the practical effects of, would we see people in Xanatar and Valyria having real-time two-way communication? We probably will. And just how much that affects the storyverse. And it's very exciting to see that difference.